In 1985, I taped a paper map of a place called the Flanaess to my bedroom wall. I was a teenager. That map came from a box set called the World of Greyhawk. It was the first world any dungeon master had ever built, just for me and my friends. We played under that map for years. Maybe you had a map like that too. My high-level wizard eventually joined something called the Circle of Eight, a council of Greyhawk's most powerful spellcasters. That title stuck with me. 40 years later, I still remember pieces of that world. Most of my games since then have run through the Forgotten Realms instead. Greyhawk stuck anyway, in a way nothing else quite has. That world came from one man's own home game, built years before it ever reached my bedroom wall. Gary Gygax built it with his friend Rob Kuntz in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Nobody outside his living room was ever supposed to see any of it. Its creator got pushed out of his own company not long after. Its entire product line got canceled outright a few years after that. For the better part of 2 decades, it was treated like a footnote. What happened to it next is a longer story than most players realize. You're watching a D&D podcast presented by Roomcast RPG. The gods of modern Dungeons & Dragons did not start as gods. Bakub and Erroneous began as house rules, dreamed up for one group's Tuesday night game. That group met in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, run by a man named Gary Gygax. Nobody outside his living room was ever supposed to see any of it. Somehow, this private game became the blueprint the entire hobby still runs on today. That legacy almost didn't survive. Your character sheet still carries pieces of it, whether you play in person or through an app. None of that started with a finished world. It started with a dungeon. Dungeons & Dragons did not begin with a world. It began with a hole in the ground. Gary Gygax and his friend Rob Kuntz built a sprawling mega-dungeon beneath a fictional keep they called Castle Greyhawk. Their home group played through it starting in 1972, testing rules that barely existed yet. Whatever worked stayed in the game. Whatever broke got thrown out the following week. Those Tuesday sessions became the actual R&D lab for Dungeons & Dragons. In 1975, TSR published Supplement 1, Greyhawk, a slim booklet credited to Gygax and Kuntz. It was not a world guide. It barely mentioned geography at all. It was a rules dump, pulled straight from what their table had been using at Castle Greyhawk. The Thief class came from those sessions. So did the Paladin. So did the Beholder, one of the most recognizable monsters the game has ever produced. Your character's stat block still carries fingerprints from a dungeon that started as one man's basement project. At this point in the story, there was no map of Oerth. There was no Flanaess, no free city, no pantheon of Greyhawk deities. There was a table, some dice, and a dungeon that kept growing every time the party came back for more. By the late 1970s, Gygax had stopped running a home game and started running a company. TSR's foreword for a proper Greyhawk sourcebook was dated February 1979, and Gygax told Dragon magazine readers that release was close. It slipped anyway. The World of Greyhawk finally hit store shelves in August 1980. A thin folio containing a 32-page gazetteer and a set of maps. That gazetteer, often called simply the folio, gave players their first real look at Oerth. It described a continent called Eric. Inside it sat a region called the Flanaess, settled over 1,000 years earlier by tribes of Flan people. The book moved fast after that. It laid out calendars and travel rates. It included a compressed history running up to the in-world year 576. It was sparse by modern standards. Most locations got a paragraph, sometimes less. That sparseness became the entire design philosophy. Gygax left blank space on purpose. He trusted individual dungeon masters to fill it with their own campaigns, rather than handing them a finished novel. Your table's Greyhawk could look almost nothing like the group next door's version. Both were equally correct. The Gazetteer covered the founding regions and the borders as they stood in that single in-world year. Little else made the cut. Everything else stayed blank. The next several years of Greyhawk material existed mainly to fill in those gaps, one region and one deity at a time. Demand outpaced the thin folio almost immediately. In 1983, TSR released an expanded version, a box set fans still call the Gold Box. It was built around a 48-page book and an 80-page companion. This was not a reprint. It was a genuine expansion. It pulled together years of Gygax's own Dragon magazine articles and folded them into one unified sourcebook. The deity section alone justified the upgrade for a lot of tables. 19 gods from Gygax's earlier Dragon columns got expanded write-ups. 31 more joined them on top of that, bringing the full pantheon to 50 named deities. That number alone dwarfing the original folio. 22 of those 50 received complete entries covering appearance, worshippers, and combat statistics. Those entries appeared in a companion booklet called the Glossography. Bokob, god of magic and arcane lore, was one of them. So was Ola Damara, the laughing rogue god of luck and wine. Your bard's patron deity, if you've ever picked one, is probably somewhere on that original list of 50. Gygax was not building this alone anymore. Len Lakofka contributed regional material. Frank Menser and Francois Frodeval added their own pieces to the growing map. Gygax later said he had planned a second box set entirely. That box would have completed Oerth as a full globe, rather than a single continent's worth of detail. It never got made. Company politics saw to that. The same politics that would push Gygax out of TSR within 2 years. In 1985, a boardroom coup pushed Gary Gygax out of the company he had built. Greyhawk did not vanish overnight. It lost its main advocate at exactly the moment TSR started chasing a different kind of fantasy. Dragonlance was outselling Greyhawk by a wide margin. It came with a tied-in novel line and a built-in story arc. TSR's resources followed the sales numbers. The physical dungeon under Castle Greyhawk went through its own reckoning during these years. In 1988, TSR published a parody adventure called Simply Castle Greyhawk. It was filled with sight gags and pop culture cameos. None of it had anything to do with Gygax's original mega dungeon. Fans hated it. Reviewers at the time called it a joke that overstayed its welcome. TSR tried again in 1990 with Greyhawk Ruins. It was a serious 128-page treatment spanning more than 20 dungeon levels beneath the castle's ruined towers. That gap was real. Designers Blake Mobley and Timothy B. Brown built it from scattered hints. Gygax had dropped those hints about the original dungeon over the years. His actual notes were never published. If your party has ever descended into those ruins, you are exploring a reconstruction, not the real thing. Nobody alive has seen it. The genuine Castle Greyhawk is the one from Gygax and Kuntz's Tuesday Nights. It still exists only in what its players remember. Greyhawk survived on smaller releases through the rest of the decade. The City of Greyhawk sourcebook arrived in 1989, written by Douglas Niles and Carl Sargent. It finally gave the Free City itself the detailed treatment the original folio never had. Then, in 1991, TSR tried something bigger. author David Cook wrote the history behind a new event called the Greyhawk Wars. TSR packaged it as a strategic board game, letting players refight the conflict themselves. 2 prequel adventures set up the war. The board game resolved it. By the end of 1991, the political map Gygax had drawn back in 1980 was no longer accurate. 6 in-game years had passed. A regional conflict started by the villain Ayaz had widened into something closer to a continental war. That gap mattered at the table. Your kingdom's borders, if your campaign had been running since the FOLIO, were probably already wrong. That was the whole point of the next release. TSR built an entire sourcebook line on one assumption. Fans wanted to see exactly how much had changed. The Greyhawk Wars needed an aftermath, and that job went to designer Carl Sargent. In 1992, TSR published From the Ashes. The box set ran across 2 96-page books, plus an updated set of the setting's iconic hex maps. It replaced Gygax's original World of Greyhawk box entirely. It described the Flanaess in the immediate wake of the war. Sargent's Greyhawk looked and felt different on purpose. Several of the human deities from the earlier editions were quietly dropped. One new demigod, Mayaheen, was added in their place. Your paladin's patron might have been one of the casualties. That depends on whether your table was still running the original Pantheon. The tone shifted darker across the board. It landed closer to TSR's grim Dark Sun setting. That was a shift from the more traditional heroic fantasy Gygax had built a decade earlier. Reviewers at the time noticed. Dragon magazine called it ambitious, praising how it blended heroic tradition with genuinely unsettling material. From the Ashes spawned its own line through 1993. It included sourcebooks like The Marklands and I Use the Evil, plus the adventure City of Skulls. The line kept growing. It also included Rary the Traitor. That book followed one of Greyhawk's most trusted wizards after he switched sides to join IUs. Betrayal sold books, apparently. None of it moved enough copies. Fan reaction to the darker tones stayed mixed at best, and sales never recovered. TSR quietly canceled the entire Greyhawk product line before the year was out. For the first time since 1975, there was no active Greyhawk line at TSR at all. Greyhawk did not stay completely dark after 1993. In 1998, Wizards of the Coast tried to bring it back with 2 slimmer releases, The Adventure Begins and The Greyhawk Player's Guide. Roger E. Moore led the effort, and his plan was bigger than either book. Wizards had commissioned him to write a full 200-plus page hardcover meant to serve as the setting's next core sourcebook. That book never got made on its own, though its outline survived. 2 years later, Wizards built the Living Greyhawk Gazetteer for 3rd edition. The team followed Moore's structure closely enough that fans still consider it the missing 3rd book in spirit. That connection was no accident. Moore ended up editing the Gazetteer himself, tying his own unfinished project to the version that finally reached print. Few players noticed the seam. If your table ever ran adventures out of the 1998 Player's Guide, you were playing through Moore's stopgap version of Greyhawk without knowing it. Greyhawk's next chapter did not come from a single sourcebook. It came from an entire company transformation. TSR collapsed financially in the mid-1990s. Wizards of the Coast acquired the property in 1997. By 2000, Wizards was rebuilding Dungeons & Dragons from the ground up for a new 3rd edition. Greyhawk's deities became the default pantheon for that edition, printed directly into the core rulebooks. These were the same gods Gygax had built out through Dragon magazine comms 20 years earlier. In November 2000, Wizards published the Living Greyhawk Gazetteer. 4 credited writers built it: Gary Holian, Eric Mona, Sean K. Reynolds, and Frederick Weining share the credit. Roger E. Moore, the same designer behind the shelved 1998 project, edited the final book. At 192 pages, it was the most detailed single Greyhawk reference the setting had ever received. It existed to support something even bigger. Wizards' organized play division, the RPGA, launched a massively shared campaign called Living Greyhawk that same year. The campaign split the Flanaess into 30 distinct regions, each region tied to a real-world country or state, and was run by volunteer coordinators. The Gazetteer was not the only anchor Wizards built during this era. In 2001, they published Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil. It was a direct sequel to one of Gygax's most famous modules from the early 1980s. That sequel mattered to old fans. In 2007, Expedition to the Ruins of Greyhawk updated the old Greyhawk Ruins dungeon for the newer 3.5 rules. The old dungeon got new stakes. It sent players back beneath Castle Greyhawk to stop the demigod Ayaz from claiming the ruins for himself. Both books treated Greyhawk's oldest material as living history worth revisiting, not a museum piece. Living Greyhawk ran from 2000 to 2008. Over 1,000 individual adventures were published across its lifespan. Tens of thousands of participants played them worldwide. That scale made it one of the largest collaborative storytelling projects the tabletop hobby had ever attempted. Your table mattered too. If you played in it, your character had a home region. That region was tied to your actual location on a map of the real world. The choices your table made could ripple into the next year's regional storyline. Living Greyhawk closed out its final storylines in 2008, the same year Dungeons & Dragons moved into its 4th edition. 4th edition did not carry Greyhawk forward as its default setting. Instead, the core rulebook shipped with an intentionally vague framework fans nicknamed Points of Light. That framework centered on a small region called the Nentir Vale, not the sprawling Flanaess. Some Greyhawk deities survived the transition anyway. They got folded into a new mixed pantheon. That pantheon pulled in gods from the Forgotten Realms and a handful of real-world mythologies. 5th edition launched in 2014 and leaned even further away from Oerth. Forgotten Realms became the flagship setting almost by default. It appeared in the player's handbook and the starter sets. It also showed up across nearly every major hardcover adventure Wizards released for a full decade. Greyhawk never technically disappeared, though individual adventures kept quietly borrowing from it. Older modules like Tomb of Horrors and the Temple of Elemental Evil kept getting referenced. They were reprinted or reworked to fit inside other settings entirely. Official support was not the whole story during these years. Fans kept the setting alive largely on their own. Fan-run projects like the Oerth Journal and the Greyhawk Online Community Wiki carried a lot of that weight. Nobody was paying them. Volunteer writers filled in the corners official products never reached. They cataloged deities, timelines, and regional history that Wizards had no plans to publish. That work still holds up. If your table has ever pulled a house rule from a fan wiki, you were drawing on unofficial scholarship. It came from exactly this kind of volunteer work. For most of a generation of new players, Greyhawk existed mainly as a name. It was attached to famous NPCs like Mordenkainen and Bigby. That was often the only trace left. If you have ever cast one of their signature spells, you were channeling Gygax's old home campaign. You just didn't know it. Most players never made that connection. The world that built the game's foundation had quietly become background trivia inside the game itself. Dungeons & Dragons turned 50 in 2024. Wizards of the Coast marked the anniversary with a full revision of its core rulebooks. Jeremy Crawford led design on the revised rule set overall. Senior designer Jason Tondro served as project lead on the new Dungeon Master's Guide specifically. Buried inside that guide was something longtime fans had been asking for since 2008. Greyhawk was back, presented as the book's built-in sample campaign setting. The chapter runs close to 30 pages, 9 of them devoted to the city itself, and the rest to the wider region around it. That texture matters. It reintroduces the factions that give the Free City its life. Groups like the Knights of the Watch and the Order of the Heart get their due, among several others. The list runs deep. It also lays out the gods of Greyhawk's pantheon in detail, listing each deity's home plane, typical worshippers, and holy symbol. The chapter opens tight. It walks Dungeon Masters through the free city of Greyhawk in close detail, before slowly widening out to the rest of the Flanaess. It ships with a double-sided poster map of Eastern Oerth and the city itself. Cartographer Mike Schley illustrated it, updated but still recognizably built on Darlene's original 1980s artwork. The map marks locations that became legendary through actual published adventures, including White Plume Mountain and the Tomb of Horrors, among others. If your table has ever run either one, you already know this ground. Some of the setting's monsters and villains never really left either. The demon lord Fraz Urblu was first imprisoned beneath Castle Greyhawk. The Lich Vecna's severed eye and hand, both iconic magic items in modern games, trace back to Greyhawk stories as well. That fight became legend. The fungal queen Zuktmoy was first defeated in Gygax's Temple of Elemental Evil, decades before newer players ever heard her name. Some of Greyhawk's fingerprints go further than most players expect. Otto's Irresistible Dance and Bigby's Hand both started as custom spells written by Gygax's own players at that original table. Even shows built outside Wizards borrowed from it. Several of Critical Role's gods, including the Dawnfather and the Spider Queen, trace back to Oerth's original pantheon. The 2024 DMG covers that lineage directly in its cosmology chapter. Wizards has been clear that no dedicated Greyhawk sourcebook is currently planned beyond this chapter. Designers have said they are watching for player demand. That demand shaped this decision. What shipped instead was a teaching tool, a working example built from the same setting that trained an entire hobby on how to run one. That much is certain. 50 years after a card table in Lake Geneva started testing rules nobody had agreed on yet, new dungeon masters are opening a fresh hardcover and finding that dungeon still waiting underneath the table.